Chapter 7 of The Woman in the Alcove. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Woman in the Alcove by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 7. Night and a Voice. Not to be outdone by the editor, I insert the article here with all its details, the importance of which I trust I have anticipated. Santa Fe, New Mexico, April . Arrived in Santa Fe, I inquired where Abner Fairbrother could be found. I was told that he was at his mine, sick. Upon inquiring as to the location of the Placide, I was informed that it was 15 miles or so distant in the mountains, and upon my expressing an intention of going there immediately, I was given what I thought very unnecessary advice, and then directed to a certain livery stable, where I was told I could get the right kind of a horse and such equipment as I stood in need of. I thought I was equipped all right as it was, but I said nothing and went on to the livery stable. Here I was shown a horse which I took to at once and was about to mount, when a pair of leggings was brought to me. "You will need these for your journey," said the man. "Journey?" I repeated. 15 miles?" The livery stable-keeper, a half-breed with a peculiarly pleasant smile, cocked up his shoulders with the remark, "3 men as willing but as inexperienced as yourself have attempted the same journey during the last week, and they all came back before they reached the divide. You will probably come back too, but I shall give you as fair a start as if I knew you were going straight through." "But a woman has done it," said I. "A nurse from the hospital went up that very road last week." "Oh, women! They can do anything, women who are nurses, but they don't start off alone. You are going alone." "Yes," I remarked grimly. "Newspaper correspondents make their journeys singly when they can." "Oh, you're a newspaper correspondent. Why do so many men from the papers want to see that sick old man? Because he's so rich?" "Don't you know?" I asked. He did not seem to. I wondered at his ignorance, but did not enlighten him. "Follow the trail and ask your way from time to time. All the goatherds know where the Placide mine is." Such were his simple instructions as he headed my horse toward the canyon. But as I drew off, he shouted, "If you get stuck, leave it to the horse. He knows more about it than you do." With a vague gesture toward the northwest, he turned away, leaving me in contemplation of the grandest scenery I had yet come upon in all my travels. 15 miles! But those miles lay through the very heart of the mountains, ranging anywhere from 6,000 to 7,000 feet high. In 10 minutes the city and all signs of city life were out of sight. In 5 more I was seemingly as far removed from all civilization as if I had gone 100 miles into the wilderness. As my horse settled down to work, picking his way, now here and now there, sometimes over the brown earth, hard and baked as in 1,000 furnaces, and sometimes over the stunted grass whose needle-like stalks seemed never to have known moisture, I let my eyes roam to such peaks as were not cut off from view by the nearer hillsides, and wondered whether the snow which capped them was whiter than any other, or the blue of the sky bluer, that the two together had the effect upon me of cameo work on a huge and unapproachable scale. Certainly the effect of these grand mountains into which you leap without any preparation from the streets and marketplaces of America's oldest city is such as is not easily described. We struck water now and then, narrow water, courses which my horse followed in midstream, and, more interesting yet, goatherds with their flocks, Mexicans all, who seemed to understand no English, but were picturesque enough to look at, and a welcome break in the extreme lonesomeness of the way. I had been told that they would serve me as guides if I felt at all doubtful of the trail, and in 1 or 2 instances they proved to be of decided help. They could gesticulate, if they could not speak English, and when I tried them with the one word Placide, they would nod and point out which of the many side canyons I was to follow. But they always looked up as they did so, up, till I took to looking up too, and when, after miles multiplied indefinitely by the winding of the trail, I came out upon a ledge from which a full view of the opposite range could be had, and saw fronting me, from the side of one of its tremendous peaks, the gap of a vast hole not 200 feet from the snow line, I knew that, inaccessible as it looked, I was gazing up at the opening of Abner Fairbrother's new mine, the Placide. The experience was a strange one. The 2 ranges approached so nearly that it seemed as if a ball might be tossed from one to the other. But the chasm between was stupendous. I grew dizzy as I looked downward and saw the endless zigzags yet to be traversed step by step, before the bottom of the canyon could be reached, and then the equally interminable zigzags up the acclivity beyond, all of which I must trace, still step by step, before I could hope to arrive at the camp which, from where I stood, looked to be almost within hail of my voice. I have described the mine as a hole. That was all I saw at first, a great black hole in the dark brown earth of the mountainside, from which ran down a still darker streak into the waste places far below it. But as I looked longer, I saw that it was faced by a ledge cut out of the friable soil, on which I was now able to descry the pronounced white of 2 or 3 tent tops, and some other signs of life, encouraging enough to the eye of one whose lot it was to crawl like a fly up that tremendous mountainside. Truly I could understand why those 3 men, probably newspaper correspondents like myself, had turned back to Santa Fe after a glance from my present outlook, but though I understood, I did not mean to duplicate their retreat. The sight of those tents, the thought of what one of them contained, inspired me with new courage, and releasing my grip upon the rein, I allowed my patient horse to proceed. Shortly after this I passed the divide, that is where the water sheds both ways. Then the descent began. It was zigzag, just as the climb had been, but I preferred the climb. I did not have the unfathomable spaces so constantly before me, nor was my imagination so active. It was fixed on heights to be attained, rather than on valleys to roll into. However, I did not roll. The Mexican saddle held me securely at whatever angle I was poised, and once the bottom was reached, I found that I could face, with considerable equanimity, the corresponding ascent. Only as I saw how steep the climb bade fair to be, I did not see how I was ever to come down again. Going up was possible, but the descent. However, as what goes up must in the course of nature come down, I put this question aside, and gave my horse his head after encouraging him with a few blades of grass, which he seemed to find edible enough, though they had the look and something of the feel of spun glass. How we got there you must ask this good animal, who took all the responsibility and did all the work. I merely clung and balanced, and at times, when he rounded the end of a zigzag, for instance, I even shut my eyes, though the prospect was magnificent. At last even his patience seemed to give out, and he stopped and trembled. But before I could open my eyes on the abyss beneath, he made another effort. I felt the brush of tree branches across my face, and, looking up, saw before me the ledge or platform dotted with tents, at which I had looked with such longing from the opposite hillsides. Simultaneously I heard voices, and saw approaching a bronzed and bearded man with strongly marked Scotch features and a determined air. "The doctor!" I involuntarily exclaimed, with a glance at the small and curious tent before which he stood guard. "Yes, the doctor," he answered in unexpectedly good English. "And who are you? Have you brought the mail and those medicines I sent for?" "No," I replied, with as propitiatory a smile as I could muster up in face of his brusque, forbidding expression. "I came on my own errand. I am a representative of the New York —, and I hope you will not deny me a word with Mr. Fairbrother." With a gesture I hardly knew how to interpret, he took my horse by the rein, and led us on a few steps toward another large tent, where he motioned me to descend. Then he laid his hand on my shoulder, and forcing me to meet his eye, said, "You have made this journey, I believe you said from New York, to see Mr. Fairbrother. Why?" "Because Mr. Fairbrother is at present the most sought-for man in America," I returned boldly. "His wife, you know about his wife." "No. How should I know about his wife? I know what his temperature is, and what his respiration is, but his wife? What about his wife? He don't know anything about her now himself. He is not allowed to read letters. But you read the papers. You must have known before you left Santa Fe of Mrs. Fairbrother's foul and most mysterious murder in New York. It has been the theme of 2 continents for the last 10 days. He shrugged his shoulders, which might mean anything, and confined his reply to a repetition of my own words. "Mrs. Fairbrother murdered!" he exclaimed, but in a suppressed voice, to which point was given by the cautious look he cast behind him at the tent which had drawn my attention. "He must not know it, man. I could not answer for his life if he received the least shock in his present critical condition. Murdered? When?" "10 days ago, at a ball in New York. It was after Mr. Fairbrother left the city. He was expected to return after hearing the news, but he seems to have kept straight on to his destination. He was not very fond of his wife. That is, they have not been living together for the last year. But he could not help feeling the shock of her death, which he must have heard of somewhere along the route. He has said nothing in his delirium to show that he knew it. It is possible, just possible, that he didn't read the papers. He could not have been well for days before he reached Santa Fe. When were you called in to attend him? The very night after he reached this place. It was thought he wouldn't live to reach the camp. But he is a man of great pluck. He held up till his foot touched this platform. Then he succumbed. If he was as sick as that, I muttered, why did he leave Santa Fe? He must have known what it would mean to be sick here. I don't think he did. This is his first visit to the mine. He evidently knew nothing of the difficulties of the road. But he would not stop. He was determined to reach the camp, even after he had been given a sight of it from the opposite mountain. He told them that he had once crossed the Sierras in midwinter, but he wasn't a sick man then. Doctor, they don't know who killed his wife. He didn't. I know, but under such circumstances every fact bearing on the event is of immense importance. There is one which Mr. Fairbrother only can make clear. It can be said in a word. The grim doctor's eye flashed angrily, and I stopped. Were you a detective from the district attorney's office in New York, sent on with special powers to examine him, I should still say what I am going to say now. While Mr. Fairbrother's temperature and pulse remain where they now are, no one shall see him, and no one shall talk to him, save myself and this nurse. I turned with a sick look of disappointment toward the road up which I had so lately come. Have I panted, sweltered, trembled for 3 mortal hours on the worst trail a man ever traversed, to go back with nothing for my journey? That seems to me hard lines. Where is the manager of this mine? The doctor pointed toward a man bending over the edge of the great hole from which at that moment a line of Mexicans was issuing, each with a sack on his back, which he flung down before what looked like a furnace built of clay. That's he, Mr. Haines of Philadelphia. What do you want of him? Permission to stay the night. Mr. Fairbrother may be better tomorrow. I won't allow it, and I am master here, so far as my patient is concerned. You couldn't stay here without talking, and talking makes excitement, and excitement is just what he cannot stand. A week from now I will see about it. That is, if my patient continues to improve. I am not sure that he will. Let me spend that week here. I'll not talk any more than the dead. Maybe the manager will let me carry sacks. Look here, said the doctor, edging me farther and farther away from the tent he hardly let out of his sight for a moment. You're a canny lad, and shall have your bite and something to drink before you take your way back. But back you go before sunset, and with this message: no man from any paper north or south will be received here till I hang out a blue flag. I say blue, for that is the color of my bandana. When my patient is in a condition to discuss murder, I'll hoist it from his tent top. It can be seen from the divide, and if you want to camp there on the lookout, well and good. As for the police, that's another matter. I will see them if they come, but they need not expect to talk to my patient. You may say so down there. It will save scrambling up this trail to no purpose. You may count on me, said I. Trust a New York correspondent to do the right thing at the right time to head off the boys. But I doubt if they will believe me. In that case, I shall have a barricade thrown up 50 feet down the mountainside, said he. But the mail and your supplies? Oh, the burros can make their way up. We shan't suffer. You are certainly master, I remarked. All this time I had been using my eyes. There was not much to see, but what there was romantically interesting. Aside from the furnace and what was going on there was little else but a sleeping tent, a cooking tent, and the small one I had come on first, which without the least doubt contained the sick man. This last tent was of a peculiar construction, and showed the primitive nature of everything at this height. It consisted simply of a cloth thrown over a thing like a trapeze. This cloth did not even come to the ground on either side, but stopped short a foot or so from the flat mound of adobe which serves as a base or floor for hut or tent in New Mexico. The rear of the simple tent abutted on the mountainside. The opening was toward the valley. I felt an intense desire to look into this opening, so intense that I thought I would venture on an attempt to gratify it. Scrutinizing the resolute face of the man before me, and flattering myself that I detected signs of humor underlying his professional brusqueness, I asked, somewhat mournfully, if he would let me go away without so much as a glance at the man I had come so far to see. A glimpse would satisfy me, I assured him, as the hint of a twinkle flashed in his eye. Surely there will be no harm in that. I'll take it instead of supper. He smiled, but not encouragingly, and I was feeling very despondent indeed, when the canvas on which our eyes were fixed suddenly shook, and the calm figure of a woman stepped out before us. Clad in the simplest garb, but showing in every line of face and form a character of mingled kindness and shrewdness. She was evidently on the lookout for the doctor, for she made a sign as she saw him and returned instantly into the tent. "Mr. Fairbrother has just fallen asleep," he explained. "It isn't discipline, and I shall have to apologize to Miss Sarah. But if you will promise not to speak nor make the least disturbance, I will let you take the one peep you prefer to supper." "I promise," said I. Leading the way to the opening, he whispered a word to the nurse, then motioned me to look in. The sight was a simple one, but to me very impressive. The owner of palaces, a man to whom millions were as thousands to such poor devils as myself, lay on an improvised bed of evergreens, wrapped in a horse blanket, and with nothing better than another of these rolled up under his head. At his side sat his nurse on what looked like the uneven stump of a tree. Close to her hand was a tolerably flat stone, on which I saw arranged a number of bottles and other such comforts as were absolutely necessary to a proper care of the sufferer. That was all. In these few words I have told the whole story. To be sure, this simple tent, perched 7,000 feet and more above sea level, had one advantage which even his great house in New York could not offer. This was the outlook. Lying as he did facing the valley, he had only to open his eyes to catch a full view of the panorama of sky and mountain stretched out before him. It was glorious, whether seen at morning, noon, or night, glorious. But I doubt if he would not gladly have exchanged it for a sight of his home walls. As I started to go, a stir took place in the blanket wrapped about his chin, and I caught a glimpse of the iron-grey head and hollow cheeks of the great financier. He was a very sick man. Even I could see that. Had I obtained the permission I sought, and been allowed to ask him one of the many questions burning on my tongue, I should have received only delirium for reply. There was no reaching that clouded intelligence now, and I felt grateful to the doctor for convincing me of it. I told him so, and thanked him quite warmly when we were well away from the tent, and his answer was almost kindly, though he made no effort to hide his impatience and anxiety to see me go. The looks he cast at the sun were significant, and having no wish to antagonize him, and every wish to visit the spot again, I moved toward my horse with the intention of untying him. To my surprise, the doctor held me back. "You can't go tonight," said he. "Your horse has hurt himself." It was true. There was something the matter with the animal's left forefoot. As the doctor lifted it, the manager came up. He agreed with the doctor. I could not make the descent to Santa Fe on that horse that night. Did I feel elated? Rather. I had no wish to descend, yet I was far from foreseeing what the night was to bring me. I was turned over to the manager, but not without a final injunction from the doctor. Not a word to any one about your errand. Not a word about the New York tragedy, as you value Mr. Fairbrother's life. "Not a word," said I. Then he left me. To see the sun go down and the moon come up from a ledge hung, as it were, in mid-air, the experience was novel. But I refrain. I have more important matters to relate. I was given a bunk at the extreme end of the long sleeping tent, and turned in with the rest. I expected to sleep, but on finding that I could catch a sight of the sick tent from under my canvas, I experienced such fascination in watching this forbidden spot that midnight came before I had closed my eyes. Then all desire to sleep left me, for the patient began to moan and presently to talk, and, the stillness of the solitary height being something abnormal, I could sometimes catch the very words. Devoid as they were of all rational meaning, they excited my curiosity to the burning point, for who could tell if he might not say something bearing on the mystery? But that fevered mind had recurred to early scenes, and the babble which came to my ears was all of mining camps in the Rockies and the dicker of horses. Perhaps the uneasy movement of my horse pulling at the end of his tether had disturbed him. Perhaps, but at the inner utterance of the second perhaps, I found myself up on my elbow listening with all my ears, and staring with wide-stretched eyes at the thicket of stunted trees where the road debouched on the platform. Something was astir there besides my horse. I could catch sounds of an unmistakable nature. A rider was coming up the trail. Slipping back into my place, I turned toward the doctor, who lay some 2 or 3 bunks nearer the opening. He had started up too, and in a moment was out of the tent. I do not think he had observed my action, for it was very dark where I lay, and his back had been turned toward me. As for the others, they slept like the dead, only they made more noise. Interested, everything is interesting at such a height, I brought my eye to bear on the ledge, and soon saw by the limpid light of a full moon the stiff, short branches of the trees, on which my gaze was fixed, giving way to an advancing horse and rider. "Halloo!" saluted the doctor in a whisper, which was in itself a warning. "Easy there! We have sickness in this camp, and it's a late hour for visitors." "I know." The answer was subdued but earnest. "I am the magistrate of this district. I have a question to ask this sick man on behalf of the New York Chief of Police, who is a personal friend of mine. It is connected with—" "Hush!" The doctor had seized him by the arm and turned his face away from the sick tent. Then the two heads came together and an argument began. I could not hear a word of it, but their motions were eloquent. My sympathy was with the magistrate, of course, and I watched eagerly while he passed a letter over to the doctor, who vainly strove to read it by the light of the moon. Finding this impossible, he was about to return it, when the other struck a match and lit a lantern hanging from the horn of his saddle. The two heads came together again, but as quickly separated with every appearance of irreconcilement, and I was settling back with sensations of great disappointment, when a sound fell on the night so unexpected to all concerned that with a common impulse each eye sought the sick tent. "Water! Will someone give me water?" a voice had cried, quietly and with none of the delirium which had hitherto rendered it unnatural. The doctor started for the tent. There was the quickness of surprise in his movement, and the gesture he made to the magistrate as he passed in reawakened an expectation in my breast which made me doubly watchful. Providence was intervening in our favour, and I was not surprised to see him presently reissue with the nurse, whom he drew into the shadow of the trees, where they had a short conference. If she returned alone into the tent after this conference, I should know that the matter was at an end, and that the doctor had decided to maintain his authority against that of the magistrate. But she remained outside, and the magistrate was invited to join their council. When they again left the shadow of the trees, it was to approach the tent. The magistrate, who was in the rear, could not have more than passed the opening, but I thought him far enough inside not to detect any movement on my part, so I took advantage of the situation to worm myself out of my corner and across the ledge to where the tent made a shadow in the moonlight. Crouching close and laying my ear against the canvas, I listened. The nurse was speaking in a gently persuasive tone. I imagined her kneeling by the head of the patient and breathing words into his ear. These were what I heard. "You love diamonds. I have often noticed that. You look so long at the ring on your hand. That is why I have let it stay there, though at times I have feared it would drop off and roll away over the adobe down the mountainside. Was I right?" "Yes, yes." The words came with difficulty, but they were clear enough. "It's of small value. I like it because—" He appeared to be too weak to finish. A pause, during which she seemed to edge nearer to him. "We all have some pet keepsakes," said she, "but I should never have supposed this stone of yours an inexpensive one. But I forget that you are the owner of a very large and remarkable diamond, a diamond that is spoken of sometimes in the papers. Of course, if you have a gem like that, this one must appear very small and valueless to you." "Yes, this is nothing, nothing." And he appeared to turn away his head. "Mr. Fairbrother, pardon me, but I want to tell you something about that big diamond of yours. You have been in and have not been able to read your letters, so do not know that your wife has had some trouble with that diamond. People have said that it is not a real stone, but a well-executed imitation. May I write to her that this is a mistake, that it is all you have ever claimed for it, that is, an unusually large diamond of the first water?" I listened in amazement. Surely this was an insidious way to get at the truth, a woman's way, but who would say that it was not a wise one, the wisest, perhaps, which could be taken under the circumstances? What would his reply be? Would it show that he was as ignorant of his wife's death as was generally believed, both by those about him here and those who knew him well in New York? Or would the question convey nothing further to him than the doubt, in itself an insult of the genuineness of that great stone which had been his pride? A murmur, that was all it could be called, broke from his fever-dried lips and died away in an inarticulate gasp. Then suddenly, sharply, a cry broke from him, an intelligible cry, and we heard him say, "No imitation, no imitation. It was a sun, a glory, no other like it. It lit the air. It blazed, burned. I see it now. I see—" There the passion succumbed, the strength failed. Another murmur, another, and the great void of night which stretched over, I might almost say under us, was no more quiet or seemingly impenetrable than the silence of that moon-enveloped tent. Would he speak again? I did not think so. Would she even try to make him? I did not think this either, but I did not know the woman. Softly her voice rose again. There was a dominating insistence in her tones, gentle as they were, the insistence of a healthy mind which seeks to control a weakened one. You do not know of any imitation, then? It was the real stone you gave her. You're sure of it. You would be ready to swear to it if— Say just yes or no, she finished in gentle urgency. Evidently he was sinking again into unconsciousness, and she was just holding him back long enough for the necessary word. It came slowly and with a dragging intonation, but there was no mistaking the ring of truth with which he spoke. "Yes," said he. When I heard the doctor's voice and felt a movement in the canvas against which I leaned, I took the warning and stole back hurriedly to my quarters. I was scarcely settled when the same group of three I had before watched silhouetted itself again against the moonlight. There was some talk, a mingling and separating of shadows. Then the nurse glided back to her duties, and the two men went toward the clump of trees where the horse had been tethered. 10 minutes, and the doctor was back in his bunk. Was it imagination, or did I feel his hand on my shoulder before he finally lay down and composed himself to sleep? I cannot say. I only know that I gave no sign, and that soon all stir ceased in his direction, and I was left to enjoy my triumph, and to listen with anxious interest to the strange and unintelligible sounds which accompanied the descent of the horseman down the face of the cliff, and finally to watch with a fascination which drew me to my knees the passage of that sparkling star of light hanging from his saddle. It crept to and fro across the side of the opposite mountain as he threaded his endless zigzags, and finally disappeared over the brow into the invisible canyons beyond. With the disappearance of this beacon came lassitude and sleep, through which hazy atmosphere floated wild sentences from the sick tent, which showed that the patient was back again in Nevada, quarrelling over the price of a horse which was to carry him beyond the reach of some threatening avalanche. When next morning I came to depart, the doctor took me by both hands and looked me straight in the eyes. "You heard," he said. "How do you know?" I asked. "I can tell a satisfied man when I see him," he growled, throwing down my hands with that same humorous twinkle in his eyes which had encouraged me from the first. I made no answer, but I shall remember the lesson. One detail more. When I started on my own descent, I found why the leggings with which I had been provided were so indispensable. I was not allowed to ride. Indeed, riding down those steep declivities was impossible. No horse could preserve his balance with a rider on his back. I slid, so did my horse, and only in the valley beneath did we come together again. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Sean Michael Hogan, St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada.
Of the Woman in the Alcove. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Woman in the Alcove by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 8. Arrest. The success of this interview provoked other attempts on the part of the reporters who now flocked into the southwest. Ere long, particulars began to pour in of Mr. Fairbrother's painful journey south after his illness set in. The clerk of the hotel in El Morro, where the great mine owner's name was found registered at the time of the murder, told a story which made very good reading for those who were more interested in the suffering and experiences of the millionaire husband of the murdered lady than in those of the unhappy but comparatively insignificant man upon whom public opinion had cast the odium of her death. It seems that when the first news came of the great crime which had taken place in New York, Mr. Fairbrother was absent from the hotel on a prospecting tour through the adjacent mountains. Couriers had been sent after him, and it was one of these who finally brought him into town. He had been found wandering alone on horseback among the defiles of an untravelled region, sick and almost incoherent from fever. Indeed, his condition was such that neither the courier nor such others as saw him had the heart to tell him the dreadful news from New York, or even to show him the papers. To their great relief, he betrayed no curiosity in them. All he wanted was a berth in the first train going south, and this was an easy way for them out of a great responsibility. They listened to his wishes and saw him safely aboard with such alacrity and so many precautions against his being disturbed that they have never doubted that he left El Morro in total ignorance, not only of the circumstances of his great bereavement, but of the bereavement itself. This ignorance, which he appeared to have carried with him to the Placide, was regarded by those who knew him best as proving the truth of the affirmation elicited from him in the pauses of his delirium of the genuineness of the stone which had passed from his hands to those of his wife at the time of their separation, and further dispatches coming in, some private and some official, but all insisting upon the fact that it would be weeks before he would be in a condition to submit to any sort of examination on a subject so painful. The authorities in New York decided to wait no longer for his testimony, but to proceed at once with the inquest. Great as is the temptation to give a detailed account of proceedings which were of such moment to myself, and to every word of which I listened with the eagerness of a novice and the anguish of a woman who sees her lover's reputation at the mercy of a verdict which may stigmatize him as a possible criminal, I see no reason for encumbering my narrative with what, for the most part, would be a mere repetition of the facts already known to you. Mr. Durand's intimate and suggestive connection with this crime, the explanations he had to give of this connection, frequently bizarre and, I must acknowledge, not always convincing, nothing could alter these, nor change the fact of the undoubted cowardice he displayed in hiding Mrs. Fairbrother's gloves in my unfortunate little bag. As for the mystery of the warning, it remained as much of a mystery as ever, nor did any better success follow an attempt to fix the ownership of the stiletto, though half a day was exhausted in an endeavour to show that the latter might have come into Mr. Durand's possession in some of the many visits he was shown to have made of late to various curio shops in and out of New York City. Mr. Durand's visits to the curio shops, as explained by him, were made with a view of finding a casket in which to place his diamond. This explanation was looked upon with as much doubt as the others he had offered, where the situation seemed to be of a compromising character. I had expected all this, just as I had expected Mr. Grey to be absent from the proceedings, and his testimony ignored, but this expectation did not make the ordeal any easier, and when I noticed the effect of witness after witness leaving the stand without having improved Mr. Durand's position by a jot, or offering any new clue capable of turning suspicion into other directions, I felt my spirit harden and my purpose strengthen till I hardly knew myself. I must have frightened my uncle, for his hand was always on my arm, and his chiding voice in my ear, bidding me beware, not only for my own sake and his, but for that of Mr. Durand, whose eye was seldom away from my face. The verdict, however, was not the one I had so deeply dreaded. While it did not exonerate Mr. Durand, it did not openly accuse him, and I was on the point of giving him a smile of congratulation and renewed hope, when I saw my little detective, the one who had spied the gloves in my bag at the ball, advance and place his hand upon his arm. The police had gone a step further than the coroner's jury, and Mr. Durand was arrested before my eyes on a charge of murder. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Marianne Coleman Hipkins. www.thisvoiceforyou.com. 9. Of the Woman in the Alcove. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne Coleman Hipkins. The Woman in the Alcove by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 9. The Mouse Nibbles at the Net. The next day, saw me at police headquarters begging an interview from the inspector, with the intention of confiding to him a theory which must either cost me his sympathy or open the way to a new inquiry, which I felt sure would lead to Mr. Durand's complete exoneration. I chose this gentleman for my confidant, from among all those with whom I had been brought in contact by my position as a witness in a case of this magnitude. First, because he had been present at the most tragic moment of my life, and secondly, because I was conscious of a sympathetic bond between us, which would ensure me a kind hearing. However ridiculous my idea might appear to him, I was assured that he would treat me with consideration, and not visit whatever folly I might be guilty of on the head of him for whom I risked my reputation for good sense. Nor was I disappointed in this. Inspector Desir was fatherly, and his tone altogether gentle, as, in reply to my excuses for troubling him with my opinions, he told me that in a case of such importance he was glad to receive the impressions of even such a prejudiced little partisan as myself. The word fired me, and I spoke. "You consider Mr. Durand guilty, and so do many others, I fear, in spite of his long record for honesty and uprightness. And why? Because you will not admit the possibility of another person's guilt, a person standing so high in private and public estimation that the very idea seems preposterous and a little short of insulting to the country of which he is an acknowledged ornament."
"My dear!"
The inspector had actually risen. His expression and whole attitude showed shock, but I did not quail. I only subdued my manner and spoke with quieter conviction. "I am aware," I said, "how words so daring must impress you, but listen, sir, listen to what I have to say before you utterly condemn me. I acknowledge that it is the frightful position into which I threw Mr. Durand by my officious attempt to write him which has driven me to make this second effort to fix the crime on the only other man who had possible access to Mrs. Fairbrother at the fatal moment. How could I live in inaction? How could you expect me to weigh for a moment this foreigner's reputation against that of my own lover, if I have reasons?"
"Reasons?"
"Reasons which would appeal to all, if instead of this person's having an international reputation at his back, he had been the simple gentleman like Mr. Durand. Would you not consider me entitled to speak?"
"Certainly, but—"
"You have no confidence in my reasons, Inspector. They may not weigh against that splash of blood on Mr. Durand's shirt front, but such as they are I must give them. But first it will be necessary for you to accept for the nonce Mr. Durand's statements as true. Are you willing to do this?"
"I will try."
"Then a harder thing yet, to put some confidence in my judgment. I saw the man and did not like him long before any intimation of the evening's tragedy had turned suspicion on anyone. I watched him as I watched others. I saw that he had not come to the ball to please Mr. Ramsdell, or for any pleasure he himself hoped to reap from social intercourse, but for some purpose much more important, and that this purpose was connected with Mrs. Fairbrother's diamond. Indifferent, almost morose before she came upon the scene, he brightened to a surprising extent the moment he found himself in her presence, not because she was a beautiful woman, for he scarcely honoured her face or even her superb figure with a look. All his glances were centred on her large fan, which, in swaying to and fro, alternately hid and revealed the splendour on her breast. And when by chance it hung suspended for a moment in her forgetful hand, and he caught a full glimpse of the great gem, I perceived such a change in his face, that if nothing more had occurred that night to give prominence to this woman and her diamond, I should have carried home the conviction that interests of no common import lay behind a feeling so extraordinarily displayed.
"Fanciful, my dear Miss Van Arsdale. Interesting, but fanciful."
I know, I have not yet touched on fact, but facts are coming, Inspector." He stared. Evidently he was not accustomed to hear the law laid down in this fashion by a midget of my proportions.
"Go on,"
he said.
"Happily, I have no clerk here to listen."
"I would not speak if you had. These are words but for one ear as yet. Not even my uncle suspects the direction of my thoughts."
"Proceed,"
he again enjoined, upon which I plunged into my subject. Mrs. Fairbrother wore the real diamond and no imitation to the ball. Of this I feel sure. The bit of glass or paste displayed to the coroner's jury was bright enough, but it was not the star of light I saw burning on her breast as she passed me on her way to the alcove.
"Miss Van Arsdale."
The interest which Mr. Durand displayed in it, the marked excitement into which he was thrown by his first view of its size and splendour, confirm in my mind the evidence which he gave on oath. And he is a well-known diamond expert, you know, and must have been very well aware that he would injure rather than help his cause by this admission, that at the time he believed the stone to be real and of immense value. Wearing such a gem, then, she entered the fatal alcove, and with a smile on her face, prepared to employ her fascinations on whoever chanced to come within their reach. But now something happened. Please let me tell it my own way. A shout from the driveway, or a bit of snow thrown against the window, drew her attention to a man standing below, holding up a note fastened at the end of a whip handle. "I do not know whether or not you have found that man. If you have—" The inspector made no sign. "I judge that you have not, so I may go on with my suppositions." Mrs. Fairbrother took in this note. She may have expected it, and for this reason chose the alcove to sit in. Or it may have been a surprise to her. Probably we shall never know the whole truth about it, but what we can know and do, if you are still holding to our compact and viewing this crime in the light of Mr. Durand's explanations, is that it made a change in her and made her anxious to rid herself of the diamond. It has been decided that the hurried scrawl should read, "Take warning, he means to be at the ball. Expect trouble if you do not give him the diamond," or something to that effect. But why was it passed up to her unfinished? Was the haste too great? I hardly think so. I believe in another explanation which points with startling directness to the possibility that the person referred to in this broken communication was not Mr. Durand, but one whom I need not name, and that the reason you have failed to find the messenger of whose appearance you have received definite information is that you have not looked among the servants of a certain distinguished visitor in town. "Oh," I burst forth with feverish volubility, as I saw the inspector's lips open in what could not fail to be a sarcastic utterance, "I know what you feel tempted to reply. Why should a servant deliver a warning against his own master? If you will be patient with me, you will soon see. But first I wish to make it clear that Mrs. Fairbrother, having received this warning just before Mr. Durand appeared in that alcove, reckless, scheming woman that she was, sought to rid herself of the object against which it was directed in the way we have temporarily accepted as true. Relying on her arts, and possibly misconceiving the nature of Mr. Durand's interest in her, she hands over the diamond hidden in her rolled-up gloves, which he, without suspicion, carries away with him, thus linking himself indissolubly to a great crime of which another was the perpetrator. That other, or so I believe from my very heart of hearts, was the man I saw leaning against the wall at the foot of the alcove a few minutes before I passed into the supper-room. I stopped with a gasp, hardly able to meet the stern and forbidding look with which the inspector sought to restrain what he evidently considered the senseless ravings of a child. But I had come there to speak, and I hastily proceeded before the rebuke thus expressed could formulate itself into words. I have some excuse for a declaration so monstrous. Perhaps I am the only person who can satisfy you in regard to a certain fact about which you have expressed some curiosity. Inspector, have you ever solved the mystery of the 2 broken coffee cups found amongst the debris at Mrs. Fairbrother's feet? It did not come out in the inquest, I noticed.
Not yet,
he cried.
But you cannot tell me anything about them.
Possibly not, but I can tell you this. When I reached the supper room that evening, I looked back, and providentially or otherwise, only the future can determine that, detected Mr. Gray in the act of lifting 2 cups from a tray left by some waiter on a table standing just outside the reception room door. I did not see where he carried them. I only saw his face turned toward the alcove, and as there was no other lady there, or anywhere near there, I have dared to think. Here the inspector found speech.
You saw Mr. Gray lift 2 cups and turn toward the alcove at a moment we all know to have been critical. You should have told me this before. He may be a possible witness.
I scarcely listened. I was too full of my own argument. There were other people in the room, especially at the end of it. A perfect throng was coming from the billiard room where the dancing had been, and might easily be that he could both enter and leave that secluded spot without attracting attention. He had shown too early and much too unmistakably his lack of interest in the general company for his every movement to be watched as at his first arrival. But this is simple conjecture. What I have to say next is evidence. The stiletto. Have you studied it, sir? I have, from the pictures. It is very quaint, and among the devices on the handle is one that especially attracted my attention. See, this is what I mean. And I handed him a drawing which I had made with some care in expectation of this very interview. He surveyed it with some astonishment. I understand, I pursued in trembling tones, for I was much affected by my own daring, that no one has so far succeeded in tracing this weapon to its owner. Why didn't your experts study heraldry and the devices of great houses? They would have found that this one is not unknown in England, and I can tell you in whose blazon it can be often seen, and so could Mr. Gray. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Marianne Coleman Hipkins. www.thisvoiceforyou.com. Of the Woman in the Alcove. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne Coleman Hipkins. The Woman in the Alcove by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 10. I Astonish the Inspector. I was not the only one to tremble now. This man of infinite experience and daily contact with crime had turned as pale as ever I myself had done in the face of a threatening calamity.
I shall see about this,
he muttered, crumpling the paper in his hand.
But this is a very terrible business you are plunging me into. I sincerely hope that you are not heedlessly misleading me.
I am correct in my facts, if that is what you mean, said I. The stiletto is an English heirloom, and bears on its blade, among other devices, that of Mr. Gray's family on the female side. But that is not all I want to say. If the blow was struck to obtain the diamond, the shock of not finding it on his victim must have been terrible. Now, Mr. Gray's heart, if my whole theory is not utterly false, was set upon obtaining the stone. Your eye was not on him, as mine was, when you made your appearance in the hall with the recovered jewel. He showed astonishment, eagerness, and a determination which finally led him forward, as you know, with the request to take the diamond in his hand. Why did he want to take it in his hand? And why, having taken it, did he drop it? A diamond supposed to be worth an ordinary man's fortune. Because he was startled by a cry he chose to consider the traditional one of his family proclaiming death. Is it likely, sir? Is it conceivable even that any such cry as we heard could in this day and generation ring through such an assemblage, unless it came with ventricular power from his own lips? You observed that he turned his back, that his face was hidden from us, discreet and reticent as we all have been, and careful in our criticisms of so bizarre an event. There still must be many to question the reality of such superstitious fears. and some to ask if such a sound could be without human agency, and a very guilty agency too. Inspector, I am but a child in your estimation, and I feel my position in this matter much more keenly than you do, but I would not be true to the man whom I have unwittingly helped to place in his present unenviable position if I did not tell you that in my judgment this cry was a spurious one, employed by the gentleman himself as an excuse for dropping the stone.
And why would he wish to drop the stone?
Because of the fraud he meditated, because it offered him an opportunity for substituting a false stone for the real. Did you not notice the change in the aspect of this jewel dating from this very moment? Did it shine with as much brilliancy in your hand when you received it back as when you passed it over?
Nonsense! I do not know. It is all too absurd for an argument.
Yet he did stop to argue, saying in the next breath,
You forget that the stone has a setting. Would you claim that this gentleman of family, place, and political distinction had planned this hideous crime with sufficient premeditation to have provided himself with the exact counterpart of a brooch, which is highly improbable he ever saw? You would make him out a Cagliostro, or something worse. Miss Van Arsdale, I fear your theory will topple over of its own weight.
He was very patient with me. He did not show me the door. Yet such a substitution took place, and took place that evening, I insisted. The bit of paste shown us at the inquest was never the gem Mrs. Fairbrother wore on entering the alcove. Besides, we're all a sensation. Why cavil at one more improbability? Mr. Gray may have come over to America for no other reason. He is known as a collector, and when a man has a passion for diamond-getting—
He is known as a collector?
In his own country.
I was not told that.
Nor I, but I found it out.
How, my dear child, how?
By a cablegram or so.
You cabled his name to England?
No, Inspector. Uncle has a code, and I made use of it to ask a friend in London for a list of the most noted diamond fanciers in the country. Mr. Gray's name was third on the list. He gave me a look in which admiration was strangely blended with doubt and apprehension.
You are making a brave struggle,
said he,
but it is a hopeless one.
I have one more confidence to repose in you. The nurse who has charge of Miss Gray was in my class in the hospital. We love each other, and to her I dared appeal on one point, Inspector. Here my voice unconsciously fell as he impetuously drew nearer. A note was sent from that sick chamber on the night of the ball, a note surreptitiously written by Miss Gray while the nurse was in an adjoining room. The messenger was Mr. Gray's valet, and its destination the house in which her father was enjoying his position as chief guest. She says that it was meant for him, but I have dared to think that the valet would tell a different story. My friend did not see what her patient wrote, but she acknowledged that if her patient wrote more than 2 words, the result must have been an unintelligible scrawl, since she was too weak to hold a pencil firmly, and so nearly blind she would have had to feel her way over the paper. The inspector started, and rising hastily went to his desk, from which he presently brought the scrap of paper, which had already figured in the inquest as the mysterious communication taken from Mrs. Fairbrother's hand by the coroner. Pressing it out flat, he took another look at it, then glanced up in visible discomposure.
It has always looked to us as if written in the dark by an agitated hand, but—
I said nothing. The broken and unfinished scrawl was sufficiently eloquent.
Did your friend declare Miss Gray to have written with a pencil and on a small piece of unruled paper?
Yes. The pencil was at her bedside. The paper was torn from a book which lay there. She did not put the note, when written in an envelope, but gave it to the valet just as it was. He is an old man and had come to her room for some final orders.
The nurse saw all this? Has she that book?
No. It went out next morning with the scraps. It was some pamphlet, I believe. The inspector turned the morsel of paper over and over in his hand.
What is this nurse's name?
Henrietta Pearson.
Does she share your doubts?
I cannot say.
Have you seen her often?
No, only the one time.
Is she discreet?
"Very. On this subject she will be like the grave unless forced by you to speak."
"And Miss Grey?"
"She is still ill, too ill to be disturbed by questions, especially on so delicate a topic. But she is getting well fast. Her father's fears, as we heard them expressed on one memorable occasion, were ill-founded, sir." Slowly the inspector inserted this scrap of paper between the folds of his pocket-book. He did not give me another look, though I stood trembling before him. Was he in any way convinced, or was he simply seeking the most considerate way in which to dismiss me and my abominable theory? I could not gather his intentions from his expression, and was feeling very faint and heartsick when suddenly he turned upon me with the remark,
"A girl as ill as you say Miss Grey was must have had some very pressing matter on her mind to attempt to write and send a message under such difficulties. According to your idea, she had some notion of her father's designs and wished to warn Mrs. Fairbrother against them. But don't you see that such conduct as this would be preposterous, nay, unparalleled in persons of their distinction? You must find some other explanation for Miss Grey's seemingly mysterious action, and I am an agent of crime other than one of England's most reputable statesmen."
"So that Mr. Durand has shown the same consideration, I am content," said I. "It is the truth, and the truth only I desire. I am willing to trust my cause with you." He looked none too grateful for this confidence. Indeed, now that I look back at the scene, I do not wonder that he shrank from the responsibility thus foisted upon him.
"What do you want me to do?"
he asked. "Prove something. Prove that I am altogether wrong or altogether right. Or if proof is not possible, pray allow me the privilege of doing what I can myself to clear up the matter."
"You?"
There was apprehension, disapprobation, almost menace in his tone. I bore it with as steady and modest a glance as possible, saying, when I thought he was about to speak again, "I will do nothing without your sanction. I realize the dangers of this inquiry and the disgrace that would follow if our attempt was suspected before proof reached a point sufficient to justify it. It is not an open attack I meditate, but one—" Here I whispered in his ear for several minutes. When I had finished, he gave me a prolonged stare. Then he laid his hand on my head.
"You are a little wonder," he declared, "but your ideas are very quixotic, very. However," he added, suddenly growing grave, "something, I must admit, may be excused a young girl who finds herself forced to choose between the guilt of her lover and that of a man esteemed great by the world, but altogether removed from her and her natural sympathies." "You acknowledge, then, that it lies between these two?" "I see no third," said he. I drew a breath of relief. "Don't deceive yourself, Miss Van Arsdale. It is not among the possibilities that Mr. Grey has had any connection with this crime. He is an eccentric man, that's all." But... "I shall do my duty. I shall satisfy you and myself on certain points, and if," I hardly breathed, "there is the least doubt, I will see you again, and—" The change he saw in me frightened away the end of his sentence. Turning upon me with some severity, he declared, "There are 999 chances in 1,000 that my next word to you will be to prepare yourself for Mr. Durand's arraignment and trial, but an infinitesimal chance remains to the contrary. If you choose to trust it, I can only admire your pluck and the great confidence you show in your unfortunate lover." And with this half-hearted encouragement, I was forced to be content, not only for that day, but for many days when... End of Chapter 10. Recording by Marianne Coleman Hipkins. www.thisvoiceforyou.com.
Of The Woman in the Alcove. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patty Cunningham. The Woman in the Alcove by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 11. The Inspector Astonishes Me. But before I proceed to relate what happened at the end of those 2 weeks, I must say a word or two in regard to what happened during them. Nothing happened to improve Mr. Durand's position, and nothing openly to compromise Mr. Grey's. Mr. Fairbrother, from whose testimony many of us hoped something would yet be gleaned calculated to give a turn to the suspicion now centered on one man, continued ill in New Mexico, and all that could be learned from him of any importance was contained in a short letter dictated from his bed, in which he affirmed that the diamond, when it left him, was in a unique setting procured by himself in France, that he knew of no other jewel similarly mounted, and if the false gem was set according to his own description, the probabilities were that the imitation stone had been put in place of the real one under his wife's direction and in some workshop in New York, as she was not the woman to take the trouble to send abroad for anything she could get done in this country. The description followed. It coincided with the one we all knew. This was something of a blow to me. Public opinion would naturally reflect that of the husband, and it would require very strong evidence indeed to combat a logical supposition of this kind with one so forced and seemingly extravagant as that upon which my own theory was based. Yet truth often transcends imagination, and having confidence in the inspector's integrity, I subdued my impatience for a week, almost for two, when my suspense and rapidly culminating dread of some action being taken against Mr. Durand were suddenly cut short by a message from the inspector, followed by his speedy presence in my uncle's house. We have a little room on our parlor floor, very snug and secluded, and in this room I received him. Seldom have I dreaded a meeting more, and seldom have I been met with greater kindness and consideration. He was so kind that I feared he had only disappointing news to communicate. But his first words reassured me. He said, "I have come to you on a matter of importance. We have found enough truth in the suppositions you advanced at our last interview to warrant us in the attempt you yourself propose for the elucidation of this mystery. That this is the most risky and altogether the most unpleasant duty which I have encountered during my several years of service, I am willing to acknowledge to one so sensible and at the same time of so much modesty as yourself. This English gentleman has a reputation which lifts him far above any unworthy suspicion, and were it not for the favorable impression made upon us by Mr. Durand in a long talk we had with him last night, I would sooner resign my place than pursue this matter against him. Success would create a horror on both sides the water unprecedented during my career, while failure would bring down ridicule on us which would destroy the prestige of the whole force. Do you see my difficulty, Miss Van Arsdale? We cannot even approach this haughty and highly reputable Englishman with questions without calling down on us the wrath of the whole English nation. We must be sure before we make a move, and for us to be sure where the evidence is all circumstantial, I know of no better plan than the one you were pleased to suggest, which at the time I was pleased to call quixotic." Drawing a long breath, I surveyed him timidly. Never had I so realized my presumption or experienced such a thrill of joy in my frightened yet elated heart. They believed in Anson's innocence, and they trusted me. Insignificant as I was, it was to my exertions this great result was due. As I realized this, I felt my heart swell and my throat close. In despair of speaking, I held out my hands. He took them kindly and seemed to be quite satisfied. "Such a little, trembling, tear-filled Amazon," he cried. "Shall you have courage to undertake the task before you? If not—" "Oh, but I have," said I. "It is your goodness and the surprise of it all which unnerves me. I can go through with what we have planned if you think the secret of my personality and interest in Mr. Durand can be kept from the people I go among." "It can, if you will follow our advice implicitly. You say that you know the doctor and that he stands ready to recommend you in case Miss Pierson withdraws her services." "Yes, he is eager to give me a chance. He was a college mate of my father's." "How will you explain to him your wish to enter upon your duties under another name?" "Very simply. I have already told him that the publicity given my name in the late proceedings has made me very uncomfortable, that my first case of nursing would require all my self-possession, and that if he did not think it wrong, I should like to go to it under my mother's name. He made no dissent, and I think I can persuade him that I would do much better work as Miss Ayres than as the too well-known Miss Van Arsdale." "You have great powers of persuasion, but may you not meet people at the hotel who know you?" "I shall try to avoid people, and, if my identity is discovered, its effect or non-effect upon one we find it difficult to mention will give us our clue. If he has no guilty interest in the crime, my connection with it as a witness will not disturb him. Besides, 2 days of unsuspicious acceptance of me as Miss Grey's nurse are all I want. I shall take immediate opportunity, I assure you, to make the test I mentioned. But how much confidence you will have to repose in me! I comprehend all the importance of my undertaking, and shall work as if my honor as well as yours were at stake." "I am sure you will." Then for the first time in my life I was glad that I was small and plain rather than tall and fascinating like so many of my friends, for he said, "If you had been a triumphant beauty, depending on your charms as a woman to win people to your will, we should never have listened to your proposition or risked our reputation in your hands. It is your wit, your earnestness, and your quiet determination which have impressed us. You see I speak plainly. I do so because I respect you. And now to business." Details followed. After these were well understood between us, I ventured to say, "Do you object, would it be asking too much, if I requested some enlightenment as to what facts you have discovered about Mr. Grey which go to substantiate my theory? I might work more intelligently." "No, Miss Van Arsdale, you would not work more intelligently, and you know it. But you have the natural curiosity of one whose very heart is bound up in this business. I could deny you what you ask, but I won't, for I want you to work with quiet confidence, which you would not do if your mind were taken up with doubts and questions. Miss Van Arsdale, one surmise of yours was correct. A man was sent that night to the Ramsdale house with a note from Miss Grey. We know this because he boasted of it to one of the bellboys before he went out, saying that he was going to have a glimpse of one of the swellest parties of the season. It is also true that this man was Mr. Grey's valet, an old servant who came over with him from England. But what adds weight to all this, and makes us regard the whole affair with suspicion, is the additional fact that this man received his dismissal the following morning and has not been seen since by anyone we could reach. This looks bad to begin with, like the suppression of evidence, you know. Then Mr. Grey has not been the same man since that night. He is full of care, and this care is not entirely in connection with his daughter, who is doing very well and bids fair to be up in a few days. But all this would be nothing if we had not received advices from England which prove that Mr. Grey's visit here has an element of mystery in it. There was every reason for his remaining in his own country where a political crisis is approaching. Yet he crossed the water, bringing his sickly daughter with him. The explanation as volunteered by one who knew him well was this: that only his desire to see or acquire some precious object for his collection could have taken him across the ocean at this time, nothing else rivaling his attention for governmental affairs. Still, this would be nothing if a stiletto, similar to the one employed in this crime, had not once formed part of a collection of curios belonging to a cousin of his whom he often visited. This stiletto has been missing for some time, stolen, as the owner declared, by some unknown person. All this looks bad enough, but when I tell you that a week before the fatal ball at Mr. Ramsdale's, Mr. Grey made a tour of the jewelers on Broadway, and with the pretext of buying a diamond for his daughter, entered into a talk about famous stones, ending always with some question about the Fairbrother gem, you will see that his interest in that stone is established, and that it only remains for us to discover if that interest is a guilty one. I cannot believe this is possible, but you have our leave to make your experiment and see. Only do not count too much on his superstition. If he is the deep-dyed criminal you imagine, the cry, which startled us all at a certain critical instant, was raised by himself and for the purpose you suggested. None of the sensitiveness often shown by a man who has been surprised into crime will be his. Relying on his reputation and the prestige of his great name, he will, if he thinks himself under fire, face every shock unmoved. I see. I understand. He must believe himself all alone. Then the natural man may appear. I thank you, Inspector. That idea is of inestimable value to me, and I shall act on it. I do not say immediately, not on the first day, and possibly not on the second, but as soon as opportunity offers for my doing what I have planned, with any chance of success. And now advise me how to circumvent my uncle and aunt, who must never know to what an undertaking I have committed myself." Inspector Dalzell spared me another 15 minutes, and this last detail was arranged. Then he rose to go. As he turned from me he said, "Tomorrow?" and I answered with a full heart, but with a voice clear as my purpose, "Tomorrow." End of Chapter 11. Recording by Patty Cunningham. 12 of The Woman in the Alcove. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patty Cunningham. The Woman in the Alcove by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 12. Almost. This is your patient. Your new nurse, my dear. What did you say your name is? Miss Ayres? Yes, Mr. Gray, Alice Ayres. Oh, what a sweet name! This expressive greeting from the patient herself was the first heart sting I received, a sting which brought a flush into my cheek which I would fain have kept down. Since a change of nurses was necessary, I am glad they sent me one like you, the feeble but musical voice went on, and I saw a wasted but eager hand stretched out. In a whirl of strong feeling, I advanced to take it. I had not counted on such a reception. I had not expected any bond of congeniality to spring up between this high-feeling English girl and myself to make my purpose hateful to me. Yet as I stood there looking down at her bright if wasted face, I felt that it would be very easy to love so gentle and cordial a being, and dreaded raising my eyes to the gentleman at my side lest I should see something in him to hamper me, and make this attempt, which I had undertaken in such loyalty of spirit, a misery to myself and ineffectual to the man I had hoped to save by it. When I did look up and catch the first beams of Mr. Gray's keen blue eyes fixed inquiringly on me, I neither knew what to think nor how to act. He was tall and firmly knit, and had an intellectual aspect altogether. I was conscious of regarding him with a decided feeling of awe, and found myself forgetting why I had come there and what my suspicions were. Suspicions which had carried hope with them, hope for myself and hope for my lover, who would never escape the opprobrium even if he did the punishment of this great crime. Were this the only other person who could possibly be associated with it, found to be the fine, clear-souled man he appeared to be in this my first interview with him. Perceiving very soon that his apprehensions in my regard were limited to a fear lest I should not feel at ease in my new home under the restraint of a presence more accustomed to intimidate than attract strangers, I threw aside all doubts of myself and met the advances of both father and daughter with that quiet confidence which my position there demanded. The result both gratified and grieved me. As a nurse entering on her first case, I was happy. As a woman with an ulterior object in view verging on the audacious and unspeakable, I was wretched and regretful, and just a little shaken in the conviction which had hitherto upheld me. I was therefore but poorly prepared to meet the ordeal which awaited me, when a little later in the day Mr. Gray called me into the adjoining room, and after saying that it would afford him great relief to go out for an hour or so, asked if I were afraid to be left alone with my patient. "Oh, no, sir," I began, but stopped in secret dismay. I was afraid, but not on account of her condition, rather on account of my own. What if I should be led into betraying my feelings on finding myself under no other eye than her own? What if the temptation to probe her poor sick mind should prove stronger than my duty toward her as a nurse? My tones were hesitating, but Mr. Gray paid little heed. His mind was too fixed on what he wished to say himself. "Before I go," said he, "I have a request to make. I may as well say a caution to give you. Do not, I pray, either now or at any future time, carry or allow anyone else to carry newspapers into Miss Gray's room. They are just now too alarming. There has been, as you know, a dreadful murder in this city. If she caught one glimpse of the headlines, or saw so much as the name of Fairbrother, which is a name she knows, the result might be very hurtful to her. She is not only extremely sensitive from illness, but from temperament. Will you be careful?" "I shall be careful." It was such an effort for me to say these words, to say anything in the state of mind into which I had been thrown by his unexpected allusion to this subject, that I unfortunately drew his attention to myself, and it was with what I felt to be a glance of doubt that he added with decided emphasis, "You must consider this whole subject as a forbidden one in this family. Only cheerful topics are suitable for the sick room. If Miss Grey attempts to introduce any other, stop her. Do not let her talk about anything which will not be conducive to her speedy recovery. These are the only instructions I have to give you. All others must come from her physician." I made some reply with as little show of emotion as possible. It seemed to satisfy him, for his face cleared as he kindly observed, "You have a very trustworthy look for one so young. I shall rest easy while you are with her, and I shall expect you to be always with her when I am not. Every moment, mind. She is never to be left alone with gossiping servants. If a word is mentioned in her hearing about this crime which seems to be in everybody's mouth, I shall feel forced, greatly as I should regret the fad, to blame you." This was a heart-stroke, but I kept up bravely, changing color perhaps, but not to such a marked degree as to arouse any deeper suspicion in his mind than that I had been wounded in my amour propre. "She shall be well guarded," said I. "You may trust me to keep from her all avoidable knowledge of this crime." He bowed, and I was about to leave his presence, when he detained me by remarking with the air of one who felt that some explanation was necessary, "I was at the ball where this crime took place. Naturally, it has made a deep impression on me, and would on her if she heard of it." "Assuredly," I murmured, wondering if he would say more, and how I should have the courage to stand there and listen if he did. "It is the first time I have ever come in contact with crime," he went on with what, in one of his reserved nature, seemed a hardly natural insistence. I could well have been spared the experience. A tragedy with which one has been even thus remotely connected produces a lasting effect upon the mind. "Oh yes, I murmured, edging involuntarily toward the door. Did I not know? Had I not been there too? Little I, whom he stood gazing down upon from such a height, little realizing the fatality which united us, and what was even a more overwhelming thought to me at the moment, the fact that of all persons in the world, the shrinking little being into whose eyes he was then looking was perhaps his greatest enemy, and the one person, great or small, from whom he had the most to fear. But I was no enemy to his gentle daughter, and the relief I felt at finding myself thus cut off by my own promise from even the remotest communication with her on this forbidden subject was genuine and sincere. But the father! What was I to think of the father? Alas! I could have but one thought. Admirable as he appeared in all lights save the one in which his too evident connection with this crime had placed him, I spent the hours of the afternoon in alternately watching the sleeping face of my patient, too sweetly calm in its repose, or so it seemed, for the mind beneath to harbor such doubts as were shown in the warning I had ascribed to her, and vain efforts to explain by any other hypothesis than that of guilt the extraordinary evidence which linked this man of great affairs and the loftiest repute to a crime involving both theft and murder. Nor did the struggle end that night. It was renewed with still greater positiveness the next day, as I witnessed the glances from which time to time passed between this father and daughter, glances full of doubt and question on both sides, but not exactly such doubt or such question as my suspicions called for. Or so I thought, and spent another day or two hesitating very much over my duty, when, coming unexpectedly upon Mr. Grey one evening, I felt all my doubts revive in view of the extraordinary expression of dread, I might with still greater truth say fear, which informed his features and made them, to my unaccustomed eyes, almost unrecognizable. He was sitting at his desk in reverie over some papers which he seemed not to have touched for hours, and when, at some movement I made, he started up and met my eye, I could swear that his cheek was pale, the firm carriage of his body shaken, and the whole man a victim to some strong and secret apprehension he vainly sought to hide. When I ventured to tell him what I wanted, he made an effort and pulled himself together, but I had seen him with his mask off, and his usually calm visage and self-possessed mien could not again deceive me. My duties kept me mainly at Miss Grey's bedside, but I had been provided with a little room across the hall, and to this room I retired very soon after this, for rest and a necessary understanding with myself. For in spite of this experience and my now settled convictions, my purpose required whetting. The indescribable charm, the extreme refinement and nobility of manner observable in both Mr. Grey and his daughter were producing their effect. I felt guilty, constrained. Whatever my convictions, the impetus to act was leaving me. How could I recover it? By thinking of Anson Durand and his present disgraceful position. Anson Durand! Oh, how the feeling surged up in my breast as that name slipped from my lips on crossing the threshold of my little room. Anson Durand, whom I believed innocent, whom I loved, but whom I was betraying with every moment of hesitation in which I allowed myself to indulge. What if the Honorable Mr. Grey is an eminent statesman, a dignified, scholarly, and to all appearance high-minded man? What if my patient is sweet, dove-eyed, and affectionate? Had not Anson qualities as excellent in their way, rights as certain, and a hold upon myself superior to any claims which another might advance? Drawing a much crumpled little note from my pocket, I eagerly read it. It was the only one I had of his writing, the only letter he had ever written me. I had already reread it 100 times, but as I once more repeated to myself its well-known lines, I felt my heart grow strong and fixed in the determination which had brought me into this family. Restoring the letter to its place, I opened my gripsack, and from its inmost recesses drew forth an object which I had no sooner in hand than a natural sense of disquietude led me to glance apprehensively, first at the door, then at the window, though I had locked the one and shaded the other. It seemed as if some other eye besides my own must be gazing at what I held so gingerly in hand. That the walls were watching me, if nothing else, and the sensation this produced was so exactly like that of guilt, or what I imagined to be guilt, that I was forced to repeat once more to myself that it was not a good man's overthrow I sought, or even a bad man's immunity from punishment, but the truth, the absolute truth. No shame could equal that which I should feel if, by any over-delicacy now, I failed to save the man who trusted me. The article which I held, have you guessed it, was the stiletto with which Mrs. Fairbrother had been killed. It had been entrusted to me by the police for a definite purpose. The time for testing that purpose had come, or so nearly come that I felt I must be thinking about the necessary ways and means. Unwinding the folds of tissue paper in which the stiletto was wrapped, I scrutinized the weapon very carefully. Hitherto I had seen only pictures of it. Now I had the article itself in my hand. It was not a natural one for a young woman to hold, a woman whose taste ran more toward healing than inflicting wounds, but I forced myself to forget why the end of its blade was rusty, and looked mainly at the devices which ornamented the handle. I had not been mistaken in them. They belonged to the house of Grey and to none other. It was a legitimate inquiry I had undertaken. However the matter ended, I should always have these historic devices for my excuse. My plan was to lay this dagger on Mr. Grey's desk at a moment when he would be sure to see it and I to see him. If he betrayed a guilty knowledge of this fatal steel, if, unconscious of my presence, he showed surprise and apprehension, then we should know how to proceed. Justice would be loosed from constraint and the police feel at liberty to approach him. It was a delicate task, this. I realized how delicate when I had thrust the stiletto out of sight under my nurse's apron and started to cross the hall. Should I find the library clear? Would the opportunity be given me to approach his desk, or should I have to carry this guilty witness of a world-famous crime on into Miss Grey's room, and with its unholy outline pressing a semblance of itself upon my breast, sit at that innocent pillow, meet those innocent eyes, and answer the gentle inquiries which now and then fell from the sweetest lips I have ever seen smile into the face of a lonely, preoccupied stranger? The arrangement of the rooms was such as made it necessary for me to pass through this sitting room in order to reach my patient's bedroom. With careful tread, so timed as not to appear stealthy, I accordingly advanced and pushed open the door. The room was empty. Mr. Grey was still with his daughter, and I could cross the floor without fear. But never had I entered upon a task requiring more courage, or one more obnoxious to my natural instincts. I hated each step I took, but I loved the man for whom I took those steps and moved resolutely on. Only, as I reached the chair in which Mr. Grey was accustomed to sit, I found that it was easier to plan an action than to carry it out. Home life and the domestic virtues had always appealed to me more than a man's greatness. The position which this man held in his own country, his usefulness there, even his prestige as a statesman and scholar, were facts, but very dreamy facts to me, while his feelings as a father, the place he held in his daughter's heart, these were real to me, these I could understand, and it was of these, and not of his place as a man, that this his favorite seat spoke to me. How often had I beheld him sit by the hour, with his eye on the door, behind which his one darling lay ill. Even now it was easy for me to recall his face as I had sometimes caught a glimpse of it through the crack of the suddenly opened door, and I felt my breast heave and my hand falter as I drew forth the stiletto and moved to place it where his eye would fall upon it on his leaving his daughter's bedside. But my hand returned quickly to my breast and fell back again empty. A pile of letters lay before me on the open lid of the desk. The top one was addressed to me, with the word "Important" written in the corner. I did not know the writing, but I felt that I should open and read this letter before committing myself or those who stood back of me to this desperate undertaking. Glancing behind me and seeing that the door into Miss Grey's room was ajar, I caught up this letter and rushed with it back into my own room. As I surmised, it was from the inspector, and as I read it, I realized that I had received it not one moment too soon. In language purposely non-committal, but of a meaning not to be mistaken, it advised me that some unforeseen facts had come to light which altered all former suspicions and made the little surprise I had planned no longer necessary. There was no allusion to Mr. Durand, but the final sentence ran, "Drop all care and give your undivided attention to your patient." End of Chapter 12. Recording by Patty Cunningham.